John Herschel Glenn Jr., Marine fighter pilot, astronaut, senator, and businessman, is one of the iconic figures of the 20th century. He is mostly remembered for his flight in the Friendship 7 Mercury capsule. Today we will take a look at 10 things you may not know about John Glenn. It's time to load the program and enter the vault. Number 10. Soda Executive. After serving as a Marine fighter pilot, test pilot, and astronaut, but before becoming a senator, John Glenn was an executive for the RC Cola Company. Initially, Glenn was approached by the company to become part of their public relations department, but Glenn declined, preferring to be directly involved in the business instead of just the face of it. Knowing this, RC Cola updated their proposal and offered Glenn a VP of Corporate Development position, along with a place on the board of directors. Glenn's role at RC would be later expanded when he was promoted to President of Royal Crown International. Number 9. Marine Corsair. Initially enlisting in the Navy in 1942, Glenn accepted an offer to transfer to the United States Marine Corps. After completing his training and a series of assignments, Glenn was assigned to VMO 155, nicknamed Ready Teddy. The squadron had just converted to the F4U Corsair, and Glenn participated in its deployments to Hawaii, Midway, and the Marshall Islands. During this time, Glenn flew 57 combat missions, where he received 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, along with 10 air medals. Glenn would continue to fly the Corsair and volunteered to join VMF 218 Squadron, where he served as part of Operation Beleaguer, a marine occupation of northeastern China following World War II. Glenn flew patrol missions against the Chinese People's Liberation Army in support of the evacuation of foreign nationals. Number 8. Taking FLAK in a Panther. In 1952, while still serving in the Marines, Glenn was ordered to South Korea to participate in the Korean War. While in Korea, Glenn flew the F-9F Panther jet as part of VMF 311. The Panther was the Navy and Marine fighter bomber used during the war, and Glenn would go on to fly some 63 combat missions in the aircraft. During this time, Glenn flew with future Hall of Fame baseball player Ted Williams, who had this to say about Glenn, quote, "Absolutely fearless, the best I ever saw. It was an honor to fly with him," end quote. As a Panther pilot, Glenn was tasked with many close air support missions, attacking enemy troops and installations on the ground. Evidently, Glenn did not shy away from enemy fire. Twice, he brought his Panther back with over 250 holes in the aircraft, a testament to the Panther's durability and Glenn's bravery. Because his aircraft drew and took so much fire, Glenn's squadron mates had a colorful nickname for him, Magnet Ass. Number 7. MiG Mad Marine. While still flying Panthers in Korea, Glenn had applied for an inter-service exchange position with the U.S. Air Force. In June of 1953, Glenn was granted the transfer and began flying the F-86 Sabre, a swept-wing fighter which was much faster than the Panther and far better suited to air-to-air combat. Like any fighter pilot, Glenn wanted to shoot down an enemy aircraft, and during the Korean War, the most sought-after target was the MiG-15, a fighter that was actually faster than the F-86 and a match for the Sabre. Glenn would write, quote, "Pilots have viewed air-to-air combat as the ultimate test, not only of their machines, but of their own personal determination and flying skills. I was no exception," end quote. The desire to tangle with MiG-15s was so pronounced in Glenn that his Air Force squadron mates painted up his F-86 to read, "MiG Mad Marine." Finally, on July 12, 1953, Glenn shot down his first MiG, then down a second one on July 19th, and would down his third and final MiG on July 22nd. The shootdown on July 22nd was part of the final air victories of the Korean War. For his service during the Korean War, Glenn received 8 more air medals and 2 more Distinguished Flying Crosses. Number 6. Super Cross Country. While still fighting in Korea, Glenn applied for training to become a test pilot. In 1954, he graduated from the program at Paxton River, and his first assignment was testing the FJ-3 Fury, which nearly killed him. The cockpit suddenly depressurized and the oxygen system failed. Following this incident, Glenn spent some time testing the F-7U Cutlass and then the F-8U Crusader. Not wanting to be regulated to a desk job, Glenn came up with a way to keep him flying while also demonstrating to the public the capabilities of the Crusader. The plan? A cross-country flight codenamed Project Bullet. The Crusader had a 586 mile/hour airspeed, which was faster than a .45 caliber bullet, hence the project's namesake. Glenn flew a Crusader some 2,445 miles non-stop from Los Alamitos, California to New York City in 3 hours, 23 minutes, and 8.3 seconds. The average speed for the entire flight was supersonic, despite having to slow down 3 times for in-flight refuelings. The Crusader that Glenn used for the flight was equipped with cameras, which captured the first ever continuous transcontinental panoramic photograph of the United States. America takes a selfie. Number 5. Astronaut Group 1. Following the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, President Dwight D. Eisenhower launched the space race. NASA, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was founded in 1959 and soon began working on Project Mercury. The goal? To get a man into Earth orbit, safely return him, and evaluate human potential in space. Eisenhower made the decision to recruit NASA's first astronauts from military test pilots. Following a grueling selection process in 1959, NASA chose its first set of astronauts, designating them Astronaut Group 1. Better known today as the Mercury 7, they would be Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, Deke Slayton, and of course, John Glenn. Eventually, all 7 would fly in space, but John Glenn famously flew the Mercury 7 capsule, becoming the first American to orbit the Earth and just the 5th person to fly in space in 1962. Of the Mercury flight, Glenn famously stated, quote, "As I hurtled through space, one thought kept crossing my mind. Every part of this rocket was supplied by the lowest bidder," end quote. He would return again to space in the late 90s. More on that later. Number 4. Gold Star Mother's Speech. Glenn was the oldest member of the astronaut corps, and realizing that he would likely be too old for the lunar landings, resigned from NASA in 1964. The day after his resignation, Glenn announced his candidacy as a Democrat for one of the Ohio U.S. Senate seats. Glenn did not get elected to the seat in 1964, dropping out of the race on March 30th, following an injury which left him unable to campaign. In 1970, Glenn ran again for the Ohio seat but was narrowly defeated in the Democratic primary by Howard Metzenbaum. Metzenbaum would go on to lose to Robert Taft Jr. In 1974, Glenn would make his 3rd attempt in the Ohio Democratic state primary, where he was again challenged by Howard Metzenbaum. Just as before, the race was close, and Metzenbaum, who was a self-made millionaire, criticized Glenn for never having held a payroll. Glenn famously replied with what became known as the Gold Star Mother speech, telling Metzenbaum to go visit a veterans hospital and stating, quote, "Look those men with mangled bodies in the eyes and tell them they didn't hold a job. You go with me to any Gold Star mother and you look her in the eye and tell her that her son did not hold a job," end quote. Glenn would go on to win the primary and general election, becoming a senator in 1974, where he served until 1999. The American Gold Star Mothers is a non-profit organization of American mothers who have lost sons or daughters while in the service of the United States Armed Forces. Number 3. Right stuff, wrong time. Leading up to the 1984 presidential elections, Glenn announced his candidacy for president in 1983. Glenn felt that the country was becoming too divided, with, in his opinion, labels like conservative and liberal contributing to the divide. Glenn saw himself as a centrist and felt that his experience as a senator made him suited to run for president. In the early stages of the campaign, polls showed Glenn as the strongest Democrat against incumbent President Reagan. However, during the fall of 1983, the movie The Right Stuff was released. The Right Stuff author Tom Wolfe said of Glenn, quote, "He had the hottest record as a pilot. He was the most quotable, the most photogenic, and the lone Marine," end quote. The film, which is based on the book, focused on the Mercury 7 astronauts, and Ed Harris's portrayal as Glenn gave the public differing opinions. Some viewed Harris's portrayal as an action-worthy Hollywood hero, while others felt that the film was a reminder that Glenn's major accomplishments had occurred decades earlier and outside of a political career. Ultimately, Glenn would withdraw from the race in March of 1984, and Walter Mondale would go on to win the Democratic nomination. In Glenn's autobiography, he would remark that the film would eventually have a, quote, "chilling effect on the campaign," end quote. Walter Mondale will go on to lose to Reagan in the general election in one of the most lopsided victories, 13 electoral votes to Reagan's 525. One has to wonder, if the movie had come out a year later, if Glenn would have made a better opponent in the 1984 election. Number 2, for research purposes. After reading a book written by NASA doctors entitled Space Physiology and Medicine, Glenn felt that the physiological changes in the body, such as loss of muscle and bone mass, and individual experiences from spaceflight are similar to those of the aging process. Glenn proposed that NASA send an elderly person into space to study the effects of spaceflight on an individual of advanced age for research purposes. Glenn proposed that the candidate to be sent on this experimental mission should be him, and began lobbying NASA in 1995. Glenn was announced as part of the STS-95 crew, which, at age 77 years old, made him the oldest person ever to go into space at the time. Glenn was the payload specialist on Discovery's STS-95 flight, which took off on October 29, 1998. Some of the experiments involved comparing several biometric measurements of Glenn to the other crew members. Glenn was also in charge of the flight's photography and videography. Glenn returned to a ticker tape parade and was awarded the NASA Spaceflight Medal in 1998. Glenn is the only person to fly in both the Mercury and Space Shuttle programs. Number 1, a message from space. Today, John Glenn is primarily remembered as the first American to orbit the Earth in 1962. What you may not know is that on that famous mission, Glenn carried a special note for a special reason. On board his Friendship 7 capsule was a note which read, quote, "I am a stranger. I come in peace. Take me to your leader and there will be a massive reward for you in eternity." End quote. The note was written in several languages. The reason for this note? A precaution in case Glenn's capsule landed near the then remote Southern Pacific Islands. An interesting historical what if would have been if Glenn's capsule had come down near an island and the note would have been presented. John Glenn lived an incredible life that spanned many accomplishments and left his mark on history. From flying a propeller-driven Corsair in World War II to orbiting the Earth less than 20 years later, Glenn is one of the iconic figures of the 20th century. Thanks for watching. More content is on the way. If you found value in this video, then click on subscribe and mash that bell so that you get notified when the next video comes out. John Glenn, a pioneer of early spaceflight, famously said, "0 G and I feel fine." Now you know.